Well, good morning, Horizon West. As you can probably very evidently see immediately, I am not Pastor Chris. So my name is Isaac, and I'm so excited to be with you guys here today. So I'm originally from Texas, God's country, as we like to call it, and I moved here to Florida about a year ago, last February. So I've been here for a little while, and I work primarily with our young adults at the John Young campus at First Orlando, and we have this thing on Tuesdays called The Table. Yep, immediately. Okay. Yeah, we had to do this first service too. Cool. We good? No more. We good? We good? You guys good? Cool. All right. So should I repeat all of that? No? Okay. No, please keep going. Please keep going. So I get to work with our young adults, and I'm really excited to be with you guys here today. But I didn't always think that I would end up in full-time ministry because back in Texas, my dad is a pastor. And, growing up I grew up as a PK, as a pastor's kid. Any other PKs or pastor's kids? A few? Yeah. So you know this. If you know a PK or if you are a PK, either you also end up in full-time ministry or you end up in jail. There's really nothing in between. So with growing up as a PK, it's actually really interesting how that happened. Back in the 1940s in Puerto Rico, there was a 17-year-old girl named Hilda, right? Hilda. 17-year-old girl who grew up in Puerto Rico. So Hilda is there growing up in her house, and then one day she has a new neighbor that moves in across the street, right? And he's cute. So she notices him. He notices her, noticing him. She notices him, noticing her, noticing him, right? And they lock eyes. And she knew it was meant to be, right? But the problem, though, is that for Hilda, she's a faithful, Jesus-following girl. And David, the neighbor, is not. He's not Jesus following, right? He's the womanizing drunk at this point in his life. So what's a girl to do? It was meant to be. So she prays, and she prays, and she fasts, and she prays that God might work in his life. And sure enough, one Saturday, David is out doing David things on a Saturday night, and he's walking down the street. And a Saul of Tarsus-like experience happens where God brings him down to his knees, and he realizes that he's a sinner in need of grace. And he decides to start following Jesus, which is amazing. So now that he's a Jesus follower, this is a Saturday night, the next day on a Sunday morning, he's like, well, what do Christians do? They go to church, so I got to go to church now. So he goes to church, and the church where he entered, guess who is leading worship that day? His neighbor, Hilda, right? So they meet, right? And they get to know each other, and they fall in love, and they get married, right? And these are my grandparents. So David, so now my grandpa David, so now he's following Jesus. So he starts telling people about Jesus, and people gather around to listen. Right? And then he goes to the parks to talk about Jesus, and people gather around to listen. And then he goes to church buildings, and people gather to listen. And then larger churches, and people gather to listen. And then large outdoor amphitheaters, and people are still gathering to listen. And after decades of ministry at this point in his life, God is using him as God is filling up soccer stadiums around North America, and people are gathering to listen to Grandpa David talk about Jesus. True story. He's like the Spanish Billy Graham, right? So through his ministry, God is saving a lot of people, including members of the Puerto Rican mob, the Puerto Rican drug cartel. See, because what's happening is that these guys that were selling drugs for these mob bosses are now no longer selling drugs. So these mob bosses, these drug cartel guys, are now losing money. And they realize that they're losing money is because their boys aren't pushing drugs anymore. And they realize, oh, David, that's the reason? Okay, well, we need to stop David. So what they did, and back in 1977, it's a Sunday afternoon in May, where typically is custom in Puerto Rico, you just kind of hang out on the front porch. So the family was just hanging out after church on the front porch, and two men in masks drove by and did a shooting at their house. to where Grandpa David got shot. And Grandpa Nilda's 16-year-old daughter also got shot. So they rushed to the hospital, and amidst the chaos and the fury, and a 16-year-old daughter is kind of recovering, but Grandpa David, man, he's in a coma in the hospital. And during this time, the Puerto Rican government told them it is no longer, or told Hilda, who's now kind of having to make family decisions because her husband is in a coma in the hospital, that it's no longer safe for them to be in Puerto Rico anymore. And she has to decide for the entire family on where to go. Man, and there, she's still a faithful following woman. Now, this is years later. She's no longer 17. She's been following Jesus for a long time at this point. But in that moment, she's just thinking and wondering and praying, God, are you showing up? God, are you going to show up here? God, I need you right now. Or are you going to show up in this moment? And that may be you right now. Maybe your story does not include the Puerto Rican drug cartel. Although if it did, that would be highly coincidental. So that may not be your story, but you're sitting there and you're still wondering, God, right here, right now, are you going to show up? This thing I have going on right now in my family life, God, are you showing up here? Right? In my health, God, are you showing up here? God, in my work, are you showing up here? God, in my finances, are you showing up here? God, I really need you right now. God, are you showing up? And as we're asking, God, are you showing up? We feel this tension because we know that there's a great big God out there. We know this. Most of us know this, right? But we're not always convinced that God is right here. Because we know that God is big and that there's a big universe. There's a lot of things to take care of. Like, I understand God's got a busy job. But God, are you here right now, right here with me? And there's a tension, right, between knowing that God is out there and knowing and believing if God is right here. And in that gap, we'll fill that gap with frustration. We'll fill that gap with doubt. We'll fill that gap with unbelief. We'll fill that gap with anger, right? And for some of us, this is why we're mad at God, because we know he's out there. He just hasn't shown up himself right here, and we get mad about it. Or for some of us, if we've been a Christian for a while, we don't want people to know that sometimes we doubt that God will provide right here. And when people ask us, we just kind of put on our smiles and everything's going to be great. But deep down, man, we have doubt sometimes. Right? The gap between knowing that God is out there and wondering if God will be here with us right here. Right? So the question that we're going to ask is, how do we know that God is both out there and right here? How do we know that God is both out there sustaining the universe and right here with us? And to ask this question, or to think through this question, we have to look through this really important lens. And the lens that we need to look through is called providence, right? Providence. And here's what providence means for you. This is what providence is for you, is that God, moment by moment, guides, cares, and is involved in your life. That God, this is important, moment by moment, not just a one-time thing, not just it happened, I think it may happen, that God, moment by moment, in God's providence, moment by moment, guides, cares, and is involved in your life, moment by moment. So we're not just left wondering if God is showing up, when is God going to show up, right? So we can think through and look through the lens of God's providence in knowing that God, moment by moment, guides, cares, and is involved in our life. So we're in this really cool series that we kicked off last week called Game Changers, where we're looking at the book of Ruth. So Pastor Chris last week kicked off this idea of being a game changer, and last week we talked about we're stuck, so how do we get unstuck? So we're continuing in that series to where last week we looked at chapter 1. And in chapter 1 in the book of Ruth, we met this dad named Elimelech. It's kind of a mouthful, Elimelech. So Elimelech had this wife named Naomi, who's the mom. So Elimelech and Naomi have 2 sons. Now, in Israel, at this time, there's a famine going on. There's not a lot of food to go around. So Elimelech, trying to be a good dad, trying to be a good husband, wanting to provide for his family, says, hey, let's go someplace where there might be food for us. So he goes to Moab. Now, Moab is not, they don't worship the God of Israel, right? They worship another God. So they're there and trying to provide, but Elimelech, when they get there, he dies. All right, Elimelech dies. And then the 2 sons, they marry Moabite women. And then the 2 sons die. So at this point in the story, all we have left are single women. Right? We have the mom who's a widow now, who's single. We have the 2 daughters that are single women now, that are widowed. And in this, so Naomi, the mom, she says, hey, let's go back to Israel because I think there will be a better place for us now that all the men are gone. So one of the daughters-in-law, she decides to stay. But the other one, as we read last week in Ruth chapter 1:16, it says this, and this is Ruth. This is Ruth, the daughter-in-law. She says this, but Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. She says, Naomi, you're not getting rid of me that easily. Like, I'm sticking with you. Right? Where you go, I'm following right beside you. Like, we are friends. We're going to care for one another. And if you go back to Israel from Moab, I too will also go to Israel. And being a non-Israelite, being a Moabite in Israel was not the best situation. But Ruth took an active step of faith, as we learned last week, to go back to Israel. Right? So currently, in Ruth's situation, she's homeless. She's hungry. She doesn't have a job. She doesn't know exactly how things are going to work out for her. But here's what she knows. She knows that she says, Naomi, your God will be my God. I'm going to worship the God of Israel, and I'm confident that he will provide. All right, so we pick up the story in Ruth chapter 2, verse 2, where it says this. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, let me go to Publix so I can, no, I'm just kidding. Let me go to the field. Let me go to the field, which is basically Publix. It's like, it's a first century Publix. Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. So basically, Ruth says, hey, we're all hungry here. We need food. Let me go try to get some food for us. And Naomi says, okay, go. That's a good idea. You should go try to get some food for us. So here we pick it up in verse 3. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. All right, let's pause here for a second. Gleaning is not a word that we hear often, if ever. Maybe that may be the first time you've ever heard the word gleaning. And here is what gleaning means. Gleaning was basically this thing that happened among people that owned fields. So what they would do is that they, in the margins of their field and in the corners, they would leave it for the poor and for widows to come in to be able to get food. Or even the grain that would fall from the stalks and hit the ground, like the people that normally work there, they didn't touch it, right? So it was basically they left, it was like the leftovers, right? Maybe your Bible translation says leftovers. They would leave the leftovers for the poor to be able to come in as a means to provide for them. It was kind of a way that was orchestrated so people were taken care of. So that's exactly what Ruth was doing, where she says, let me go and glean. Hey, Naomi, mother-in-law, maybe there's some leftovers that I can go and maybe I can find some scraps for us to eat. So the verse continues in verse 3, where it says, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, right? She happened to come. She randomly came by pure coincidence. What are the odds? She got so lucky. The Bible is being a bit sarcastic right here, where it says she happened to come to this part of the field. Because this guy named Boaz is amazing. Boaz literally means strong man, right? He's a strong man, and he owns the field. So what do we learn about Boaz, who was of the clan of, who is this? This is Elimelech, right? This is the father-in-law. So this guy is family with her husband's dad, right? So he's kind of part of the family, which is amazing. So she just randomly, accidentally, coincidentally went to the field of Boaz, this guy who was kind of family of her husband. So like what we see as random, God sees as providence. What we think is an accident, God sees as care and how he's providing for us. Remember, providence is that God is guiding us, God is caring for us, God is providing for us, God is involved moment by moment in our lives. And here we see that this just so happened, she happened to come is not a just so happened. That God, the sovereign king of the universe, is orchestrating everything. So Ruth does not just so happen to go to a field. God is orchestrating Ruth to go to the field of Boaz because God knows that as Ruth goes to the field of Boaz, that there will be provision for her there. Ruth doesn't know it yet. Here's what Ruth is doing. Ruth is just taking a step. She doesn't know what's going to happen. She's confident that God will provide. She doesn't know how God's going to provide. So she just takes a step of faith, trusting in God's provision, right? So who is Boaz, right? So this is another single person. So typically a lot of times in church we talk about married people. Not today, right? We're talking about a lot of single people, right? Because I know a lot of us here, my hand included, are single, whether we're single or whether we're single again, right? So in this story we get to look at the really cool lives of people who are single. So Boaz, so we said it literally means strong man. So he says this in verse 4. He came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." So here's what Boaz is. He worships the God of Israel, that he's a worthy man. He's wealthy. He owns land, right? He has social status. And here's what he does for Ruth. Is he provides for her, right? He says this prayer. This is a normal day at the office for Boaz. He doesn't know what's going to happen today. He's just in his normal day in, day out. He knows God's providence. He knows that God guides. He knows that God cares. He knows that God is kind of ruling everything. He knows that God is involved moment by moment in his life. So as he's leading this business, he's very aware that God is guiding and leading. So this is just a normal day at the office where he offers this prayer of the Lord bless you, and all of his employees saying the Lord bless you, right? So here's what he does. Ruth doesn't have any friends at this point other than her mother-in-law. So he provides her with friends. He says, hey, later on in the passage we'll read, hey, stay with these women. They're gonna take care of you. They're going to help you out. Go ahead and get all of the food, all the grain that you need. I want to make sure you're well fed. Hey, don't go to the other fields. I'm not sure if it's safe for you there. Because I don't know what the other guys are like. Here, stay in my field. It's safe for you. I already told my guys they're not going to put a hand on you. Nothing bad's going to happen. They're going to take care of you. Not only that, they're going to help you get water. They're going to help you get additional food. All right, so Boaz is providing for Ruth. Hey, Ruth, why don't you come over for dinner? And as you come over, just eat everything you want. I want you to be filled, and I want you to be satisfied. What do we think about Boaz? Seems like a good dude, right? Yeah? Spoiler alert for later, he's a very eligible bachelor, but we're not talking about that today. So Boaz provides for Ruth, and then he does this very interesting thing. We're going to jump down to verse 12, where he says this, "The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward will be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." So Boaz doesn't just pray for his general business. He pauses and he prays for Ruth. And he says, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Because currently, Ruth, She's wondering, God, I know you're out there. Are you going to show up here? I'm going to take a step of faith and see if you're going to show up right here, right? But she's still hungry. She doesn't know how things are going to work out. She's widowed. She's not in the best circumstance. She doesn't have the best family life right now. She's just taking a step of faith and wondering, kind of hoping. So Boaz sees this, prays for her, prays that the wings of the Lord will cover her and provide for her. And this is what Boaz does, is Boaz doesn't just pray for her. Boaz is actually the means of provision for Ruth. As he's asking the Lord, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, Ruth is under the wings of the Lord. But the way that she's under the wings of the Lord is that she will be provided for by Boaz. This is incredible. So Boaz prays for provision and then steps in and is actually the means of provision for Ruth. Right? So here's the big idea, is that God shows up in our right here, often through other people. God shows up in our right here, often through other people. Right? As we're wondering if God is going to show up, we know that God is out there. God, are you going to show up right here? We can look at the story of Ruth and Boaz and be confident that God, yes, he's going to show up right here. And the way that God often shows up right here is through other people. Right? Think about this. Where you currently are right now in life, where you live, it was probably because of other people that helped get you to where you are. As you think about your job, right? Most people get jobs through networking. What is that? That is God providing for us through other people, right? Our family life, how you met your spouse, for those of us that are married, it was probably through other people, right? Those of us that are involved in hobbies, the things that are provisions for us in life probably more often than not came because of other people. So God shows up in our right here, often through other people, right? Ruth meeting Boaz was no accident. It was not a coincidence, right? It's just so happened she went to that field. No. God is sovereign. In God's providence, Ruth specifically went to that field. She had no idea what was going to happen. All Ruth did was take a step. And in that step, God used that to provide for her. It was not an accident for Ruth to meet Boaz, because God is sovereign, and in God's providence, he guides us. God cares for us. God is interacting and leading us moment by moment. So where you are in life, whatever your situation, whatever your right here is, whatever season that you're in right now that may be a little tough and you're just wondering, how is God going to provide? God, are you going to provide? God, when are you going to provide? God, I've been waiting for you to show up for a little while now. What's going to happen here? It's because God is going to do something in his providence. And all we can do is just take a step in faith, knowing and trusting that God will provide. So how do we respond? How do we respond to this? How do we respond tomorrow at work? How do we respond when we go to lunch with our friends or with our family or by ourselves after church? How do we respond with think about what we did yesterday? What does that mean? What does it mean of this idea that God is going to provide often through other people, right? So here's how we respond. You have to hear for the right here. As we wonder, God, you are out there. God, are you right here? I need you to show up right now. Are you showing up right here? Hear for the right here. We need to hear. We need to be listen. We need to listen. We need to be aware of how God might show up in our right here. And I know for some of us, as we've talked about these two characters, some of us really identify with Ruth, meaning we're in a place where we really need some provision right now. That we may or may not be taking steps of faith, but in our current situation, knowing that God is out there, wondering if God is going to be right here. Our right here is so real to us. It's so impactful for us. It makes us, maybe gets us really emotional as we think about it. It kind of disturbs us, stresses us a little bit. We don't know what to do. We don't know how things are going to work out in our right here. So my encouragement to you is like Ruth, just hear for the right here. Knowing that as we pause, we know that God is provident over the whole world and he's working things that we don't even know is going on right now. All right? At every given moment, God is doing 10,000 things in your life, and we may only be aware of 3 of them. God is working, God is providing, sometimes in ways that we can see, and oftentimes in ways that we can't see. But man, my encouragement for us Ruths in the room is that we just take a step of faith and trust, and we know that God is going to provide. And as we look at Ruth, often how God provides is through other people. Right? What a cool opportunity every Sunday here at Horizon West, where we have this entire network of relationships, where people can come together and get to know each other like a family, to be able to provide for one another. Because, I know we have a lot of Ruths right here, sitting right here in this room. They're just wondering and hoping if God is going to provide. And some of us identify with Boaz, is where we get to step into that role of provision. Some of us, we seem to be well established, things seemingly are going well in life, and man, what a cool opportunity for us to be able to use our resources, be able to step into that role of provision for someone else. So as we hear for the right here, man, how cool it would be for we hear for someone else's right here. We can hear for someone else's right here. As we think through circumstances in our life and as we think through situations in other people's life, we can step into that role of provision, right? It is not an accident where you live. It is not an accident where you work. It is not an accident the things that you are involved in. It is not an accident the people that you know. This is all God's providence working together for his glory and for your good and for the good of others. Right? So maybe this is a very developing community here in Horizon West and in Winter Garden and in Claremont and the surrounding areas. This place is booming. Houses are getting built, right? So maybe even in your neighborhood, maybe people are moving in. It is not an accident where you are. God possibly is using that as a means of provision for someone else. Where someone else moves in across the street, they meet you. You form a relationship, you become friends, they have a need, you're like, oh, actually have resources to be able to meet that need. That's God's providence. God is using you to provide for someone else. And where you work, in your office or in your cubicle, or if you stand behind a counter or behind a desk, and either there's a customer or there's a coworker, and something just seems to be off. They used to be one way, and maybe for the last few weeks or day or season, they've been a different way. It's possible something's going on. It's possible there needs to be provision in their life. And it's very, very possible that God wants to use you to be able to step into that role of provision for someone else, to be Boaz. So if we're Ruths or if we're Boazes, we need to hear for the right here, knowing that moment by moment in God's providence, God is guiding, God is caring, God is involved in our life, God is involved in our decision making, God is involved in the little things that we think are random and are accident. It's not an accident to God. God is orchestrating things in ways that we don't even know. So, as I said, for some of us in this room, we're in a season of singleness. Either we're single or we're single again. So in this story, we can look at some single people and how they were living their life, right? So in this story, if we look at Boaz, how was he using his singleness? He was using it as a way to provide for a lot of people, which is amazing, right? He's caring for his employees. He's caring for the poor and the widows that are coming in. And in the same way, for those of us that are in a season of singleness, we have more time than we would if we had a family right now. So for people that have families, which is amazing, your primary source of provision and responsibility is your family, as it should be. But for those of us that are single, we can spend our time and we can spend our resources as a means to provide for a lot of people, not just our immediate family, right? We have a little more disposable income. We have a little more time on our hands. So we can use that to be able to step into the role of Boaz, to be able to provide for a lot of people. So friends, what would happen if we did this? What would happen if we did this? What would Horizon West look like? What if Horizon West and the surrounding areas and in Claremont and Winter Garden and the other cities, what would it look like if people that had needs knew, oh, Horizon West, oh yeah, that place, yeah, those people, man, they provide for others. I used to have a need and now I don't because there were Christians living in Horizon West. I used to have a need, but then I got really plugged into the Horizon West Church, and oh my gosh, the church family. I didn't even know I needed a church family, but as soon as I stepped into my church family, I didn't even know how many needs I had until they just saw things in my life, and they just started providing for me in ways that I didn't even know I needed to be provided for. Or for some of us, we have very present provision that we need, very tangible things that we need help with. So how cool would it be if we as a church came together to be able to provide for other people, that there were no needs because we took care of them, that God was providing for his children here in the Horizon West area, and we just got to step into that role to be able to provide for other people. How cool would that be? Where you live to be able to provide for other people. How cool would that be? Your kid's friend, and then you meet the family and the parents. That's not an accident. And they have a need. How cool would it be to step into that role of provision? What would this community look like if the Christians here were known as people that provided for others? It'd be a game changer. You would be a game changer in the community, in your life, in the life of every single person that you interact with. So we'll close with the story. So my grandmother is in the hospital, right? And the Puerto Rican government tells them it's no longer safe for them to be in Puerto Rico anymore. So she doesn't know what to do. She's wondering, God, are you showing up here? She's wondering, she's hoping, she's praying. So as she's praying, there was a family pastor in Texas, Pastor Thomas, who heard about what happened to David and Ilda and their family in Puerto Rico. So he heard what happened, he prayed for them, and like Boaz, he didn't just pray, he was also a source of provision to where he told one of his church leaders to call the Puerto Rico family and invite them to come to Texas because it was going to be safe for them there, and they could provide for them and the family there. So Grandpa David eventually recovers, and he gets wheeled from the hospital to the airport. They jump on an airplane. They fly to Texas, where they are provided for because the Christians stepped up and provided when they heard there was a need. So the next day is a Sunday, so they go to church, and the church of the Pastor Thomas back in Texas, and the families interact, and they meet, and 16-year-old daughter recovers. And turns out, Pastor Thomas in Texas, he has a 16-year-old son. You see where this is going? So they meet, they interact, they kind of discovering things, eventually start dating, and eventually get married, right? And eventually have a daughter, and eventually have a son, and that son is me, right? So this is my family story. This is God's providence on my mom's side of my family. This is God's providence on my dad's side of my family. This is God orchestrating everything. We have my mom's side of the family, which is Ruth. They needed some provision. We have my dad's side of the family, that was Boaz. They prayed, and they were a means of provision. And in that, God is orchestrating everything, not by happenstance, not because it was so lucky, right? Not because of coincidence, because God is sovereign. And God's providence means that he guides, he cares, and is involved moment by moment in our lives. As I would literally not be alive if it were not for God's providence orchestrating everything together. Man, and that's my hope, and that is my prayer for all of us, is that we would just rest knowing that God guides, God cares, and God is involved in our life. So to wrap up the story, so my grandpa David, he lived a very, very full life and passed away a few years ago. And Grandma Ilda is very much alive, and today's actually her birthday. She is 88 years old today, so I'll let her know that you guys said happy birthday. So we're going to take this time to respond, and maybe you are Ruth. You just need some provision right now. There's something going on. You don't know how it's going to happen. You don't know when it's going to happen. You feel a little anxious because of it, maybe a little frustration. My prayer is that we can rest knowing that God is the provider. And for some of us, we're Boaz. And maybe we have or we have not considered how we can use our resources to be able to provide for others. So my prayer is that whether we identify more with Ruth or with Boaz, or honestly, a lot of us is probably both, right? We're probably in some way kind of both, is that God will reveal to us how we might rest in his provision. So I just pray for all of us this morning that we will be the church in your name. In Jesus' name, amen.